A man raised two wolves, but when they grew up, everyone was shocked. What would make a man who has lost everything fight for someone else's life again? Especially if that life is not human. This story began in late spring, when the forest around the village of Zalesia smelled of rotten leaves and damp earth. Yegor Sokolov, a former gamekeeper and now a sullen recluse, was walking along a barely visible path. His tall, stooped silhouette seemed to be part of this ancient forest. He wasn't looking for anything, just pacing out his melancholy, which had become his only companion 5 years ago. The sudden smell of blood made him stop. The smell was sharp, wrong. It hit his nose, and Yegor, obeying an old instinct, veered off the trail. A few meters away, he saw her. The she-wolf lay on her side, her gray fur matted with blood. Bullet casings lay nearby. Poachers. Yegor clenched his teeth. Rage, cold and familiar, burned inside him. He moved closer. The den had been ransacked. The bodies of dead cubs lay around. But suddenly he heard a quiet, barely audible squeak. Bending down, Yegor pushed aside the dry leaves. There, huddled together, two tiny bundles of life were trembling. Blind and helpless, they poked their noses into the void, searching for their mother. At that moment, something broke in the icy armor that Yegor had built around his heart. He looked at them and saw not predators. He saw orphans, just like he was in his heart. Without hesitation, he carefully picked them up. The wolf cubs were weightless and warm. He opened his old canvas jacket and tucked them into his bosom, close to his heart. For the first time in 5 years, he hurried home not to hide from the world, but to save a tiny part of it. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We're curious to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. It motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. The village of Zalesia lived its own life. People dug gardens, repaired fences, and gossiped about their neighbors. People rarely spoke about Yegor Sokolov, and when they did, it was with reluctance. After the accident that took his wife and daughter, he was as good as dead to everyone. He shut himself away in his house on the outskirts of the village, right on the edge of the forest. And now this strange, unsociable man was doing something that no one could have imagined. He had become a mother to 2 wolf cubs. The first days were the hardest. He got some goat's milk from an old woman named Nura, paying her with money he silently placed on the table. He fed the cubs from an old pipette every 2 hours, day and night. He hardly slept. He sat by the box covered with rags, listened to them breathe. One of them, the larger and darker one, snorted loudly and demandingly. Yegor named him Thunder. The second one, lighter and more graceful, breathed quietly, almost inaudibly. She became Lightning. His calloused hands, accustomed to axes and guns, learned tenderness. He wiped their muzzles, massaged their bellies, and warmed them with his body heat. And when they opened their eyes for the first time, the first thing they saw in this world was the face of a bearded man with bottomless sadness in his eyes. They knew no other mother. Yegor became their world. His hands were their cave. His voice, hoarse and rare, became their law. Summer passed. The wolf cubs grew not by days, but by hours. The clumsy puppies turned into graceful, strong animals. Summer came into its own. The air rang with the chirping of grasshoppers, and a thick haze hung over the fields. The wolf cubs, now several months old, had turned into energetic teenagers. The enclosure that Yegor had built for them behind the house had become too small. They spent most of their time outdoors, but never strayed far from home. The forest was their playground, and Yegor was the center of their universe. He watched them for hours. The personalities that had been barely noticeable in childhood were now fully revealed. Grom was the embodiment of strength and confidence. Large, dark, with powerful paws, he was afraid of nothing. If a hedgehog crossed their path, Grom would try to attack it head-on, snorting from the pricks and growling angrily. Lightning was different. She was a strategist. Smart and cautious, she would circle the hedgehog, study it, and try to poke it with her paw from the other side. She could sit in ambush for hours, tracking a mouse, while Thunder would have lost patience long ago. Yegor taught them, but he didn't teach them what a she-wolf would have taught them. He taught them boundaries. When they played and bit his hand too hard, he made a sharp, guttural sound, and the wolves immediately loosened their jaws. He nipped any attempts they made to take an interest in the neighbors' chickens. He showed them how to hunt voles, but led them away from the trails that led to the pastures. They were his pack, and he was their leader. But their little world couldn't stay a secret forever. The first to notice something was wrong was the old shepherd Semyonik. He saw Yegor going into the forest, followed by two beasts gliding like shadows. They weren't dogs. They were too big, their movements too wild. At first, he didn't tell anyone. But then Baba Nura saw the wolves when she went mushroom picking. She crossed herself and rushed back to the village, dropping the mushrooms from her basket. The news spread through Zalesia like wildfire. Sokolov is keeping wolves. The hermit has completely lost his mind. They're predators. Today they'll come for the goats, tomorrow for the children. The fear that had been dormant in the people awoke. Fear of the forest, of wild nature, which had always lived in the village. And this fear found its target, Yegor and his strange family. Children stopped going to the forest to pick berries. Women looked around as they walked to the store. Men gathered at the well in the evenings, and their conversations grew louder and angrier. "We have to do something," said Stepan Kuznetsov, a burly farmer nicknamed Borovoy because of his build and stubbornness. "Before something bad happens. These aren't dogs, they're killers." Hatred and fear gathered over Yegor's house like a storm cloud. He could feel it. He saw the looks they gave him on his rare trips to the village. He heard the conversation stop when he walked by. But he said nothing. What could he tell them? That these killers slept at his feet, trustingly resting their heads on his knees? That they licked his hands and whimpered with joy when he returned? People wouldn't believe him. To them, a wolf would always be a wolf. One evening, an old UAZ drove up to his house. The local police officer, Andrei Sergeyevich Volkov, got out. He was young, fit, with tired eyes. His surname sounded like a cruel irony in this situation. He stopped at the gate, hesitating to enter. Grom and Molnia immediately jumped out from behind the house. Grom stood in front, lowering his head and growling softly. The hair on his neck stood on end. Lightning stood slightly behind him, tense as a string, scanning the stranger with intelligent eyes. Yegor came out onto the porch. "Quiet," he said curtly. The wolves did not stop growling, but moved away and sat down at his feet. The scene was impressive. A sullen, bearded man and two almost adult wolves, ready to rush to his defense at any moment. The local police officer swallowed. "Yegor Petrovich," he began, trying to speak calmly. "There are rumors going around the village. People are complaining. They say you're keeping wolves." Yegor looked at him silently. "Petrovich, it's illegal and dangerous. You understand? These are wild animals. No one knows what they're capable of." "I know," Yegor replied hoarsely. These were the first words he had spoken. "They're safer than your village dogs, which attack every passerby." The police officer sighed. He could see that it was useless to argue. "I understand how you feel. But the law is the law. For now, this is just a warning, an official one. Think about it, Petrovich. Get rid of them. Give them away somewhere, before it's too late." He got into his car and drove away. Yegor stared after him for a long time. Then he lowered his hand and patted Grom on the back of the neck. "I won't give them away," he whispered into the thick fur. Never. He didn't know that with this decision, he had started the countdown to disaster. A thunderstorm broke out during the night. The sky split with flashes of lightning, and a wall of rain poured down on the ground. In the chicken coop of Stepan Kuznetsov, the same Borov, frightened chickens huddled together. That night, a fox came to visit them. An old, experienced predator, she easily found a gap under the net and slipped inside. The smell of fear and easy prey intoxicated her. In Yegor's house, the wolves were restless. They paced around the room, whimpering and sniffing the air. The smell of the fox and the panic of the domestic birds reached them even through the noise of the rain. The instinct of a predator defending its territory took over. Thunder, unable to withstand the pressure, struck the flimsy door of the enclosure with a powerful blow. The wood cracked. Another blow. The latch gave way. Two gray silhouettes darted into the night, disappearing in the pouring rain. They were not rushing toward the chicken coop. They were rushing toward the scent of a foreign predator on their territory. When they burst into the chicken coop, the fox had already killed 2 chickens. Seeing the wolves, she squealed and tried to dash for the exit, but it was too late. Thunder knocked her down with one blow. The short, fierce fight was over in a few seconds. Having killed the intruder, the wolves lost all interest in the chickens. But then the door of the chicken coop flew open. Stepan stood in the doorway. He had been awakened by the noise and grabbed a lantern and a pitchfork. The light from the lantern revealed a horrific scene. Dead chickens on the floor and 2 huge wolves with bloodied muzzles standing over them. Stepan screamed. He screamed not out of fear but out of rage. He saw only what he wanted to see: Yegor's wolves tearing his chickens apart. He did not notice the dead fox thrown into the corner. He saw only the predators standing over his property. Thunder and lightning, blinded by the light and frightened by the screams, darted out of the chicken coop and disappeared into the night. The next morning, the whole village was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Stepan, waving his pitchfork, told everyone how man-eating wolves had broken into his yard. "I told you. I warned you. Today it's the chickens, and tomorrow what? They'll start attacking the children." His words fell on fertile ground of fear. People gathered in a crowd. Their faces were angry and determined. Someone brought an axe, someone else a hunting rifle. The crowd moved toward Yegor's house. They walked in silence, and that silence was more terrifying than any scream. Yegor saw them from afar. He understood everything without words. He stepped out onto the porch. Behind him, like 2 statues, thunder and lightning stood motionless. They sensed the threat emanating from the people and growled quietly. "Come out, Sokolov!" Stepan shouted. "Enough, you've had enough. Get rid of your creatures, or we'll get rid of them ourselves." The crowd took a threatening step forward. Yegor didn't move. He just looked at them, and there was so much contempt and cold fury in his gaze that the people stopped for a moment. But then, kicking up dirt, a police UAZ flew up to the house. The local police officer, Volkov, jumped out. He stood between Yegor and the crowd. "Stop! Everyone stand still. Disperse!" he shouted authoritatively. Then he turned to Yegor. His face was gray. Stepan Kuznetsov has written a statement, an official one. I have no choice, Petrovich. He sighed heavily and pronounced his sentence. 3 days. I'm giving you 3 days. Either you hand them over to the zoo or they'll have to be put down. In 3 days, I'll come back with backup. Make up your mind. The crowd reluctantly dispersed. Threats and anger gave way to a waiting, ominous silence. The village lay in wait, like a predator before the jump. Yegor remained alone on the porch of his house. The police officer left, casting a parting glance that held more sympathy than condemnation. But what good was sympathy when an axe was hanging over your head? 3 days. 72 hours. The clock was ticking. He sank down onto the step, his huge body seeming to deflate. He wrapped his arms around his head. Thunder approached and poked him in the palm with its wet nose. Lightning lay down at his feet, resting its head on his knees, and looked into his eyes. There was no fear in its intelligent, amber gaze. Only boundless trust in the question, what happened, leader? How could he explain it to them? How could he explain that the human world, which he himself despised, had sentenced them to death? He stroked their thick, forest-scented fur, and a lump formed in his throat. The zoo. He imagined them in a cramped cage. Grom, pacing along the bars, going mad with helplessness. Lightning, cowering in the corner, her eyes dull. No, that would not be life, but slow torture. Release them into the forest? He knew better than anyone what awaited them. They were not afraid of humans. They did not know what a real pack was. They would go to the first village they came across in search of food or die in a fight with their wild kin who would not accept strangers. That was also death, only delayed. The first night was the longest. Yegor didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of his wolves. Images from the past flashed through his mind. Here he was teaching his little daughter to ride a bike. Here was his wife laughing, her head thrown back. And then there was twisted metal, the wail of sirens, and silence. The same silence that now reigned in his home. He realized that by saving the wolf cubs, he was trying to fix the past. He was trying to protect those he couldn't protect then. And now he was losing again. The law, fear, human stupidity, everything was against him. He stood up and went to the safe. He took out his old trusty rifle. He placed 2 cartridges next to it. His hands were shaking. Put them to sleep. A word invented by humans to hide something simple and terrible. To kill. He could have done it himself. Quickly, without pain. It would be more merciful than a cage or starvation in the forest. He looked at the sleeping wolves, and the barrel of the gun seemed unbearably heavy. No, he couldn't do it. He would not become the executioner of his own family. In the morning, he left the house with a haggard gray face. He had to do something. Maybe leave. Pack his things, take the wolves, and go to the deep taiga, where there were no people. But he was not young, and the forest he loved did not forgive mistakes. It was a desperate, crazy plan, but it was the only plan he had left. Meanwhile, tension in the village reached a boiling point. Stepan Borov wouldn't let up. He went from house to house, adding fuel to the fire. 3 days, he thundered. The police gave them 3 days. What if they arrest someone in those 3 days? Who will be responsible? He rounded up a group of men to form a people's militia. They walked around the outskirts with pitchforks and axes, keeping a close eye on the forest. They felt like heroes, defenders. But in reality, They were driven only by primitive fear. The local police officer, Andrei Volkov, was also restless. The case wouldn't leave him alone. Something wasn't right. Stepan was too confident, too vivid in his descriptions. On the second day, Andrei, under the pretext of an additional inspection, went back to Kuznetsov's house. Stepan greeted him with open arms, as if he were his savior. While he was singing like a nightingale in the kitchen, Andrei went out into the yard. He went into the same chicken coop. The heavy smell of blood and bird droppings hit his nose. He carefully examined everything again, and in the far, dark corner, covered with straw, he saw it. A small red corpse. A fox, with a broken neck. Everything fell into place. The wolves hadn't killed the chickens. They had killed the fox that had gotten into the chicken coop. They had, in essence, protected Stepan's farm. And he, either in a panic or deliberately, had kept quiet about it. Andrei felt a cold anger boiling inside him. He had been deceived. And because of this lie, he had given an ultimatum to a man who was probably not to blame for anything. While the police officer was making his discovery, Yegor said goodbye. He had spent the whole day with the wolves. He hadn't tried to train them or teach them anything. He had just been with them. He led them to a distant lake where they loved to swim. Grom ran at full speed into the water, raising a fountain of spray, while Molnia cautiously waded in and caught small fish with her paws. Yegor sat on the shore and watched them. He tried to remember every detail. How the sun played on their wet fur, how they shook themselves off, showering him with raindrops, how they looked at him loyally. He tried to teach them to be afraid of people. He yelled at them several times, stamped his feet, trying to scare them. But they just tilted their heads in confusion and came up to lick his hand. They didn't understand. In their world, he was their protector. He was a god. And a god couldn't be scary. By evening, they returned home. Yegor threw them a large piece of meat, their last meal. He didn't eat himself. He sat on the porch and watched the sun set behind the treetops. There was one night left. Tomorrow morning, the local police officer would arrive, and it would all be over. He had made his decision. Under cover of darkness, he would leave. He would go with them into the forest, as far as the eye could see. It was a 1 in a million chance. But he had to take it. At that very moment, another drama was unfolding in the village. The sun had already touched the horizon, painting the sky in crimson hues, when a desperate woman's cry rang out across Zalesye. "Misha! Mishka, son!" It was Stepan Kuznetsov's wife screaming. Their 7-year-old son, Mishka, a restless and curious boy, had been playing in the yard just an hour ago. Now he was nowhere to be found. At first, they searched for him themselves. They called out his name, looked in the barns and at the neighbors' houses. But there was no sign of the boy. When dusk began to fall on the village, panic set in. Stepan, who had been so formidable and confident just a moment ago, turned into a frightened father. His face turned pale. He ran around the village, looking into every yard, shouting at the top of his voice. "Has anyone seen Mishka?" People poured out into the street. Forgetting about the wolves, about Yegor, about all their fears, they rushed to search for him. The forest. It was the only thing that came to mind. The boy was often drawn there. Despite all the prohibitions, he would run away to the forest to look at anthills or collect pine cones. The men grabbed lanterns and headed for the edge of the forest. They shouted and shone their lights into the darkness, but the thick forest wall responded only with silence and the rustling of leaves. Time passed. It was getting colder. Fear gripped their hearts like an icy vice. Everyone understood that a night in the forest could be the last for a small child. 2 hours passed. The search yielded no results. The forest kept its secrets. The people were exhausted. Hope faded with every passing minute. Stepan sat on the ground at the edge of the forest, his head in his hands. All his arrogance, all his ostentatious strength had vanished. All that remained was animal fear for his child. The local police officer, Andrei, approached him. "Stepan, this isn't working. We're just wandering around in the dark. We need someone who knows this forest, every bush, every path." Stepan looked up at him with eyes full of despair. "Who? Yegor?" The name he had uttered with hatred now sounded like his last hope. "Yes," Andrei said firmly. "He's the only one who can help. He and his wolves." At the mention of wolves, the men began to murmur. "Are you crazy, Commander? Go to that man-eater. He killed the boy himself." But Stepan jumped to his feet. A mad decision flashed in his eyes. He didn't care anymore. Wolves, devils, anyone, as long as he found his son. "Let's go," he croaked to the policemen. The two of them separated from the crowd and almost ran to the house on the outskirts. Yegor was just finishing getting ready. Canned food, ammunition, and a first aid kit were packed into an old backpack. He had already thrown on his jacket when there was a frantic banging on the door. Grom and Molnia jumped up, growling. Yegor froze. Could it be so soon? He grabbed his rifle. "Who's there?" he shouted. "Open up, Sokolov. It's me, the local cop. Kuznetsov is with me. It's urgent." Yegor slowly opened the door. Standing in the doorway, in the dim light of a single bulb, were his two enemies. The police officer looked tired and determined. And Stepan. Yegor had never seen him like this before. His face was contorted with fear. His clothes were dirty. He looked at Yegor not with hatred, but with supplication. "What do you want?" Yegor asked coldly, clutching his rifle. "Petrovich," the local cop began. "We're in trouble. Stepan's son is missing. Misha, he's lost in the forest. We've been looking for him for hours, but it's no use." Yegor remained silent, his face impassive. He looked at Stepan, the man who had wanted to kill his family, who had turned the whole village against him. And suddenly, the man collapsed to his knees, right in the mud in front of the hermit's house. "Sokolov, Yegor, I beg you," Stepan wheezed. "You know the forest. Help me find him. I'll give you anything you want. Just help me." Yegor looked down at his enemy, humiliated and crushed by grief. Next to him, sensing the tension, Grom growled. Lightning stepped forward and stood between Yegor and the newcomers, like a living shield. A single question hung in the forest's silence. Would the man whom the whole world had turned its back on help save the son of his worst enemy? Yegor looked at Stepan kneeling before him. Seconds stretched into eternity. The entire village, all their enmity, all their grievances, all of it was now condensed into a single point, into a single desperate plea in the eyes of the man he hated. Yegor looked at his wolves. Grom stood like a rock, ready to tear anyone apart at his command. Lightning stared at him, waiting for a decision. She didn't see an enemy. She saw the leader who had to give the order. And at that moment, Yegor realized that it wasn't about Stepan. It was about the child, about a little life lost in the darkness. He knew all too well what it was like to lose a child. He slowly lowered his gun. "I need something of his," he said hoarsely. "Something with his scent on it. Quickly." Stepan raised his head, his face contorted with sudden, convulsive hope. He jumped up, turned around, and stumbled back toward the village, shouting as he ran, "Bring his jacket, quick!" Andrei, the local police officer, exhaled. He didn't know what he had expected. But this silent, weighty response was stronger than any words. He looked at Yegor with new, undisguised respect. A few minutes later, Stepan's wife came running up, out of breath, handing Yegor a small t-shirt that smelled of home and childhood. Yegor took it. He didn't give it to the wolves right away. He looked at the men gathered at the edge of the forest. "You three go." He nodded to the police officer, Stepan, and another man who looked the strongest. "The rest of you wait here. Don't make any noise. Only shine your flashlights at your feet. Follow me, don't fall behind. And most important, whatever happens, don't touch my wolves." He dropped to one knee. "Lightning, look," he said quietly, bringing the t-shirt to her nose. The wolf strategist took several deep breaths. Her ears flattened, her whole body tensed, turning into one solid nerve. She raised her head, looked into the darkness of the forest, then poked her nose back into the fabric. Thunder stood nearby, watching. He was the strength. Lightning was the brain. Finally, she made a soft, questioning sound, and without looking back, trotted into the thicket. "Follow me." Yegor called over his shoulder and stepped into the darkness. They entered the forest. The world changed instantly. The temperature dropped, and the smells became sharper. The lanterns illuminated ferns that looked like the skeletons of prehistoric birds and pine trunks stretching into the impenetrable blackness of the sky. Lightning raced ahead, confidently, almost without stopping. It looped around, bypassing windbreaks, but never lost track for a second. Thunder moved slightly to the side, silently, like a ghost. It was their protection. It controlled the flanks, its ears constantly turning, catching every rustle. Stepan, stumbling over roots, kept his eyes fixed on the two gray backs ahead. Just a few hours ago, he had dreamed of seeing those backs in his rifle sights. Now they were his only hope. District Police Officer Andrei brought up the rear. He was amazed. He had seen service dogs at work before, but this was something else. This wasn't training. This was the primitive, perfect work of predators on the trail. An hour passed, then another. The forest did not want to let them go. They forced their way across a stream and pushed through thickets of thorny bushes. Stepan fell several times, got up silently, and ran on. His clothes were torn, his face scratched by branches. But he felt no pain. All he felt was hope slipping away with every passing minute. Suddenly, lightning stopped. She whimpered, raising her head. The trail ended at a small swamp. She ran around it several times, poking her nose into the ground, and looked at Yegor in confusion. Stepan's heart sank. "That's it?" he whispered through parched lips. "That's all?" Yegor approached the she-wolf. He placed his hand on her neck. "Quiet. Think." He began to examine the ground himself. And his keen hunter's eye noticed something that others would have missed. A barely visible, smudged print of a child's boot on the edge of the quagmire, and next to it, several broken branches. The boy realized there was no way forward and turned back. "He went around," said Yegor. He let Molnia sniff the t-shirt again, pointing in the right direction. The wolf, receiving a new command, picked up the trail again. They walked for about another half hour. The forest became sparser. An old, overgrown clearing appeared ahead. Yegor knew this place. Once there had been a farmstead here, but now there was no trace of it left, except for an old well. Molnia quickened her pace. She was no longer looking for tracks on the ground. She was running along the top, with the wind in her ears. She jumped out into the clearing and, without hesitation, rushed toward a dark hole in the center, overgrown with nettles and burdocks. She stopped at the very edge and whined loudly and demandingly. The men ran out into the clearing after her. "Here!" Yegor shouted. They ran up to the well. The old log structure was almost rotten. Stepan pushed everyone away and shone his lantern down. And there, at the bottom, about 5 meters down, waist deep in icy water, stood his son, alive. He was clinging to the slippery wall and crying quietly from the cold and fear. "Misha! Son!" Stepan shouted so loudly that it seemed as if the trees were cracking. The boy raised his tear-stained face. "Dad!" The relief was so strong that Stepan's legs buckled. He almost collapsed to the ground. The local police officer immediately took command. "Okay, calm down. We need a rope. Does anyone have one?" There was no rope. "Belts, tie your belts together." They hurriedly unbuckled their belts and tied them together into a flimsy structure. Yegor examined the well. The walls were old and could collapse. They had to act quickly. He was about to give the command when suddenly Grom, standing at the edge of the forest, let out a deep, hollow growl. The hair on his back stood on end. Yegor froze, listening. Everyone else, busy with the rescue, didn't notice anything. But Yegor knew that growl. It was not a growl directed at a human. It was the growl of a wolf at an equal, at a mortal enemy. From the thicket came the crack of breaking branches. And then they heard it. Deep, low breathing, like the work of a blacksmith's bellows. Stepan, already leaning over the edge of the well, turned around. The light from his lantern flashed toward the forest. Everyone froze in terror. Out of the darkness, breaking through the bushes, a huge dark mountain emerged into the clearing. A bear, a large shaggy beast, awakened and angry. Its small eyes burned like red coals in the light of the lanterns. It was about 30 meters away and moving straight toward them, attracted by the smell of humans and the voices. "Back," hissed Yegor. "Slowly. Back." But it was too late. The bear had caught the scent of easy prey. It reared up on its hind legs and let out a deafening roar. The men panicked and backed away from the well. Stepan fell on his back, crawling away and covering his head with his hands. The police officer grabbed his gun, but his hands were shaking so much that he could barely hold it. At that moment, when human fear paralyzed everyone, something incredible happened. The thunder did not recede. It took a step forward, then another. It did not roar loudly. It made a low, throaty sound, full of rage and determination. It was challenging the master of the forest. The bear lowered himself onto all 4 paws and moved forward, confident in his strength. He did not see the wolf as a serious threat, and that was his mistake. When the bear was no more than 10 meters away, Thunder sprang forward. He did not rush at the beast head on. Like lightning, he darted to the side, coming up behind the bear and aiming for its hind leg. The bear roared in pain and surprise, spinning around. But while it was turning, Thunder was already on the other side. He acted like an experienced fighter, dodging the deadly blows of the clawed paws and delivering short, furious bites. It was a dance of death. But he was alone against a killing machine. The bear, enraged, finally got the better of him and struck. The blow landed on his side. Grom let out a cry and flew several meters, crashing heavily to the ground. The bear, sensing victory, turned and moved again toward the people, toward the easy prey at the well. Stepan screamed in horror, realizing that it was all over. And then a second gray shadow flew out of the darkness. Lightning. She did not attack. She did what no one expected. With a single leap, she found herself between the bear and the well. She stood over the hole where the frightened boy sat at the bottom, bared her teeth and growled, ready to die but not to let the beast near the child. Her desperate roar gave the men a few precious seconds. and it gave time to Thunder, who, staggering and bleeding, got back on his feet. Grom rose. His side was torn open. He was limping, but his eyes burned with an unquenchable fire. He saw Lightning standing in defense, and it gave him strength. He lunged at the bear again, but now his attack was different. It was an attack of desperation. He clung to the bear's neck, hanging on with all his weight. The bear roared, shaking his head, trying to throw off his opponent. He thrashed his back against the trees, but the wolf held on with a death grip. This furious, self-sacrificing attack gave the people the chance they needed. While the two predators were locked in a deadly embrace, the local police officer, Andre, overcoming his paralysis, regained control of the situation. "Pull!" he shouted. "Faster!" They grabbed the improvised rope made of belts again and lowered it into the well. "Misha, hold on!" Stepan shouted, leaning down so far that he was almost being held by his legs. The boy, crying from fear and cold, clung to the belt. "Pull, all together!" They pulled, sliding on the wet grass. The moment seemed like an eternity. Beasts roared nearby, branches broke, and the ground shook from their struggle. Finally, they pulled him out. Wet, shivering, but alive. Stepan grabbed his son in his arms, pressing him close, muttering incoherent words. He covered the child's eyes so he wouldn't see the terrible battle. The bear finally managed to throw off Grom. He tossed the wolf aside like a rag doll. Grom hit the trunk of a pine tree and fell silent. The bear, breathing heavily, turned toward the people. He was wounded, angry, but not defeated. He took a step toward them. The Lightning did not retreat. It stood over the rescued child like a marble statue, growling and baring its fangs. It was ready to meet death. Police officer Andre raised his gun. He knew that Makarov's pistol was no match for a bear, but he had to try. He aimed at the huge head, and at that moment, the bear stopped. He looked at the people, at the growling she-wolf, at the motionless body of the second wolf. He had been repelled. Unexpectedly, fiercely. The prey had proved too expensive. It snorted, sniffing the air, then slowly, reluctantly turned and disappeared into the thicket, breaking branches as it went. A deafening silence fell over the clearing. All that could be heard was the heavy breathing of the people and the sobs of the rescued boy in his father's arms. All eyes were fixed on one thing: the motionless body of Grom. Yegor was the first to step toward him. He knelt down next to his wolf. His usually impassive face was contorted with pain. He carefully touched the torn side. Grom was still alive. He was barely breathing, and blood was flowing from his mouth. Lightning, satisfied that the danger had passed, ran up to her brother. She whimpered, thinly, plaintively, like a puppy, and began to lick his wounds. She looked at Grom, then at Yegor, and in her eyes was a desperate plea for help. Stepan Kuznetsov stood there, holding his son close, watching the scene. Shock. That was the only word that could describe his state. He had come here to find his child, and he found something much more. He saw something he would never have believed in his life. Two wolves, two predators he considered soulless killers, had just saved his life and that of his son. One of them was dying after a battle with a bear, and the second, instead of running away, was protecting a human child. His entire world, built on simple and understandable rules. Friend or foe, predator or prey, collapsed in an instant. He looked at Yegor, who was leaning over the dying wolf, and for the first time saw in him not a crazy hermit, but a man capable of such love and devotion that it made wild animals become heroes. The other men were silent too. They were stunned. The picture was too powerful. Too wrong from the point of view of their life experience. A wolf bleeding to death to save a man. It didn't make sense. Local cop Andrei lowered his gun. He approached Yegor. "Petrovich, is he alive?" he asked quietly. "Barely." Yegor replied hoarsely, without taking his eyes off Grom. "He needs a vet. Urgently. Otherwise, he won't live till morning." Andrei nodded. He took out his phone. There was almost no signal. But at the very edge of the clearing, he found a single stick. "Hello, Petrovna? This is Volkov." "Yes, the local cop." "Wake up Viktor Semenovich." "Yes, the vet. Urgent. Tell him to take everything he needs for the operation and come to me in Zalesye." "Yes, right now." "Here. Here, a bear has mauled a dog. A very big one. I'll wait." He lied about the dog. He knew that the vet wouldn't drive so far at night for a wolf. He looked at Stepan. "Go back to the village. Take the boy home. Petrovich and I will try to carry him." Stepan looked at his son, then at Yegor and the wolves. He didn't move. "I'll help," he said firmly. It was the first thing he had said since the fight. There was no fear or hatred in his voice, only a dull, heavy sense of guilt and duty. Yegor looked up at him. He didn't answer, just nodded. They made a kind of stretcher out of jackets and 2 sturdy sticks. Carefully, trying not to cause any more pain, they laid Grom's heavy, limp body on it. Lightning flashed nearby, never straying more than a step away, and howled softly. The way back was slow and painful. They were not just carrying a wounded animal. They were carrying the weight of their mistakes, their fear, and their salvation on their shoulders. When they emerged from the forest, the entire village was waiting for them. Hearing what had happened from the returning man, the villagers poured out into the outskirts. They silently parted, letting the strange procession pass. In the light of the headlights and flashlights, they saw everything. The bloodied, lifeless wolf on the stretcher, the exhausted Yegor, Stepan covered in blood, carrying the wounded animal along with his enemy, and the she-wolf walking beside them, ignoring the crowd and looking only at her brother. The shock on the people's faces was even stronger than Stepan's had been in the clearing. They had expected anything, tragedy, blood. But not this. Not this silent, tragic heroism. No one said a word. No one shouted, "Murderers." They just stood and watched. And in their eyes, fear gave way to amazement, and hatred to something like shame. They did not see monsters. They saw saviors. And in the center of it all, silent and sullen as always, walked Yegor. He didn't look at the people. He looked only at his Grom, praying to all the gods he had long since stopped believing in for only one thing: that he would survive. The stretcher was carried into Yegor's yard and carefully lowered to the ground. At that moment, an old Neva pulled up to the house. A sleepy, elderly veterinarian, Viktor Semenovich, got out with a large medical bag. He came closer, putting on his glasses, and whistled. Well, a dog. He knelt down next to Grom. "Okay, shine the light here. Pulse, thread-like pulse. Massive blood loss. Not much chance, guys. Very little." The veterinarian's words sounded like a death sentence. Stepan Kuznetsov shuddered when he heard them. He looked at his son, who was standing next to his mother, and couldn't take his eyes off the wolves. He looked at Yegor, whose face had turned into a stone mask of suffering. And he realized that he couldn't just stand there and watch. "Do everything you can, Semyonich," he said loudly and firmly. "I'll pay whatever it takes. Do you hear me? Any amount of money. Just save him." The veterinarian looked up at him in surprise. He knew Stepan as a stingy and stubborn man. But now there was a different man standing before him. "Well, if that's the case, we'll give it a try," he said. "I need a table, lots of light and hot water, and an assistant with strong nerves. We'll operate right here. Yegor immediately volunteered to help. They carried Grom into the house and laid him on a large kitchen table, which they had covered with a clean sheet. Stepan's wife and other women brought lamps, boiling water, and bandages. Yegor's entire house, which until recently had been a place of alienation and fear, was transformed into an operating room. People who, just a few days ago, had wanted to kill these animals were now doing everything they could to save one of them. Lightning remained outside. She was not allowed to enter. She lay down at the threshold, resting her head on her paws, and kept her eyes fixed on the door. She waited. The whole village waited. The tension was almost palpable. Could a man atone for his guilt by saving the one he had condemned to death? The operation lasted almost 4 hours. 4 hours of tense silence, interrupted only by the quiet commands of the veterinarian, the clanging of instruments, and the heavy breathing of Yegor, who assisted with unwavering concentration. His huge, calloused hands, accustomed to rough work, moved with surprising precision, handing him tampons and clamps. He did not leave the table for a minute. His face was paler than chalk, but he held on. Outside the door, on the porch, sat Stepan. He had not gone home. He sat on the cold steps, his head in his hands, listening. Next to him, pressed against his leg, sat the rescued Misha. The boy did not cry. He just stared at the door behind which his savior was fighting for his life. People stood at the gate. There were only a few, the most steadfast. They did not disperse, smoking and talking quietly. The whole village was awake, waiting for the outcome. Lightning lay at the threshold. She didn't move, only occasionally raising her head when a particularly sharp sound came from the house. She felt her brother's pain, felt the tension of the people. And she waited. Finally, at dawn, when the sky began to lighten in the east, the door opened. The veterinarian stepped out onto the threshold. He was exhausted, his coat covered in blood. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes wearily. Everyone froze. Stepan jumped to his feet. "Well, Semyonich?" he gasped. The veterinarian looked at him, then at Yegor, who had followed him out. "I did everything I could," he said slowly. "The wounds are terrible. The blood loss is critical. I stitched up everything I could. I gave him everything he needed. Now it's up to him. The night will tell if he survives. 50-50. No more." These words brought no relief, but they gave hope. Grom was carefully carried from the table to an old mattress that had been laid out in the corner of the room, near the stove. He was unconscious, covered with a blanket, and only the faint movement of his sides indicated that he was still alive. Yegor knelt down beside him. He didn't leave. He just sat there, resting his hand on the wolf's head and looking at him. For the first time in many years, he prayed, not with words, but with his whole being, with his tormented soul. He didn't pray for himself. He prayed for the one who had become more than just an animal to him. People began to disperse little by little. The veterinarian drank a mug of hot tea and left, promising to return in the evening. Stepan approached Yegor. "Petrovich," he began, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? "Thank you"? That was too insignificant. "I'm sorry." It was too late. He simply placed a wad of money on the table. "This is for medicine. If you need anything else, let me know." Yegor didn't even turn his head. "Take it," he said hoarsely. "I don't need your money." "But Stepan began. "You'd better go," Yegor interrupted him. "Go to your son." Stepan understood. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't a refusal either. It was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on yet. He nodded silently and left. The day dragged on endlessly. The thunder didn't let up. His breathing was weak and labored. The lightning, which was finally allowed into the house, lay down next to his brother. She didn't whine or fuss. She just lay there, warming him with her body, and from time to time gently licked his muzzle. She was his pack, his last link to the world of the living. In the evening, another event took place in the village. The local police officer, Andrei Volkov, arrived. But he was not alone. With him was a man in a strict suit, a representative of the district administration. News of what had happened had reached the authorities. Without waiting for an investigation, Andrei wrote a detailed report himself, in which he described everything without omission. Stepan's false accusation, the disappearance of the child, and the heroic behavior of the wolves. He understood that he was taking a risk. But after that night in the forest, he could not act any other way. The official entered the house. He looked with surprise at the wounded wolf, at the she-wolf lying nearby, at Yegor, who looked like a shadow of his former self. He listened again to Andrei's story, then to Stepan's, who, unable to hide his tears, told him how it had all happened. The official was silent for a long time, tapping his fingers on the folder. "The situation is, of course, unprecedented," he said at last. "By law, wild animals must be confiscated. But given the exceptional circumstances, saving a child's life, I think we can make an exception. We'll register it as an experimental rehabilitation program under your personal responsibility, Yegor Petrovich, and under your personal supervision, Comrade District Police Officer." It was a victory. Unexpected, hard-won. The wolves were allowed to stay. The threat had passed, but Yegor was in no mood to celebrate. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on Grom. The main battle, the battle for life, was not yet over. The night was critical. Grom was tossing and turning in his delirium. He whimpered and pawed at the ground, as if he were running through the forest again. Yegor moistened his lips with water and changed his bandages. He didn't move a step. Toward morning, the wolf fell silent. Yegor listened in horror. There was no breathing. He pressed his ear to Grom's chest. Silence. Yegor's heart stopped. "No," he whispered. "No." And at that moment, he heard it. A muffled, barely discernible, but steady, calm beat. Another one, and another. The crisis had passed. Grom would live. Yegor lowered his head to the wolf's chest, and for the first time in many years, his shoulders shook with silent, manly sobs. He cried from grief, from happiness, from the unbearable tension of the last few days. He cried, and Lightning came up and nudged his cheek with her wet nose, licking away his salty tears. Several weeks passed. Summer was coming to an end. Grom was slowly but surely recovering. He was already standing on his paws, though he limped badly. He slept a lot, and Molnia and Yegor took good care of him. Life in the village had also changed. Yegor was no longer treated like a stranger. People greeted him, brought milk for the wounded wolf, and asked about his health. They did not become friends. There was still a gulf between them, but now a fragile bridge of respect had been built across it. Stepan came almost every day. He didn't say much. He just sat on the porch, smoked, and watched Grom take his first tentative steps around the yard. Once he brought Mishka with him. The boy wasn't afraid. He approached Molnia, who was lying in the sun, and held out a piece of sugar to her. The wolf strategist looked at him in surprise, then cautiously took the treat with her lips. Grom, who was watching the scene, raised his head and tried to wag his tail for the first time since he had been wounded. That day, the ice finally began to melt. Yegor went out onto the porch and sat down next to Stepan. They sat there in silence for a long time. "You forgive me, Petrovich," Stepan finally said, looking somewhere toward the forest. "For everything." Yegor did not answer. He simply handed Stepan his pack of cigarettes, and they lit up together. In that silence, in that simple gesture, there was more forgiveness than in any words. The story of the wolves who saved the child spread throughout the district. Once, journalists from the local newspaper even came to see Yegor. They wanted to write a heroic article. But when Yegor saw them, he just went into the house silently and locked the door. He didn't need fame. He didn't need words. He had everything he needed. His pack was together. His heart, which he thought was dead, was beating again. He had found his world. Not among people, but not completely detached from them either. He found it here on the porch of his old house, where two loyal creatures lay next to him, who had taught the whole village what true courage, loyalty, and love were. Autumn came. The forest was painted in gold and crimson. Thunder had almost completely recovered from his wounds. A long, ugly scar remained on his side as a reminder of that terrible night. But he was strong and confident again. Yegor sat on the porch, cleaning his old rifle. Grom and Lightning lay at his feet, basking in the rays of the mild autumn sun. Mishka approached the gate. He was now a frequent visitor here. He was holding a bowl of warm milk in his hands. "This is for Grom," he said seriously. "Mom said it's good for him." Yegor nodded. Mishka put the bowl on the ground. Grom lazily raised his head, looked at the boy, then at Yegor, as if asking for permission. Yegor nodded slightly. The wolf approached and began to lap up the milk. Lightning came over and nudged the boy's hand with her nose. The boy laughed and hugged her around the neck. Yegor watched this scene, and a faint but genuine smile appeared on his stern, weather-beaten face. He was no longer alone. He was the leader of a strange but wonderful pack. What do you think was the main lesson for the villagers in this story?